I'd like to welcome everyone and thank you for joining us today. We have people today joining from all around the globe. In the spirit of reconciliation, the American Australian Association acknowledges the traditional custodians of the land in which we meet and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past, present, and emerging, and extend that respect to all traditional owners of the lands that each of us work and live on today. I'm Melissa Babbage, and I'm the Vice Chair of the American Australian Association in the US, although I have relocated back to Sydney. I'm very proud to be associated with the AAA, which has a long and impressive history of serving the relationship between the United States and Australia. For over 70 years, the AAA has developed and strengthened the relationship between Australia and the United States by promoting cooperation, economic growth, and cultural understanding. While our efforts have largely been driven out of the US, we are delighted to be increasing our Australian presence, building upon the existing foundations established by our affiliate, AAA Limited, here in Australia. Together, we look forward to creating greater synergies and opportunities across the Pacific. Importantly, since 2002, the AAA's philanthropic scholarship and grant programs have awarded almost $13 million to over 900 American and Australian graduates, artists, and veterans, further advancing the careers of the next generation of leaders, developing international networks, and generating solutions that help address the global issues of our time. Since its inception, the AAA provides an important platform for collaboration and exchange between political and business leaders. Today's Business Resilience webinar, in conversation with Innes Willox, the Chief Executive of the Australian Industry Group, will explore and discuss current issues affecting business, from COVID-19, its impact, recovery, and future outlook for business, as well as trade issues, climate policies, and other issues relevant to Australian and American businesses in Australia. I'm delighted to be able to welcome Innes Willox today. Thank you so much for being able to join us. Melbourne-based, Innes has led the Australian Industry Group, the AIG, which is Australia's leading industry organisation, and he has led that since 2012. He concurrently serves as a director or chair on various boards and councils, including Australian Super, the Innovative Manufacturing Cooperative Research Centre, Industry 4.0 Advanced Manufacturing Forum, and the Migration Council of Australia, amongst other appointments. Commencing his career as a journalist with The Age, Innes has since held a number of prestigious private sector and government positions in Australia, Singapore, and America. He has served global public affairs for Singapore Airlines, as Chief of Staff to Australian Foreign Minister Alexander Downer, and as Australia's Consul General in Los Angeles. In those roles, he represented Australian interests on the West Coast, including in trade, finance, culture, biotechnology, the environment, and energy sectors. Outside of work, Innes is on the board of Windermere, Victoria's oldest family and child services agency, and is a lifetime supporter of the Collingwood Football Club. So thank you again for joining us today. And we are very pleased to have today's session moderated by Amanda Drury. Welcome, Amanda. Mandy has enjoyed an extensive and high-profile 24-year media career working in the global centres of New York, Tokyo, London, and Singapore. Like many of us in recent times, Mandy has relocated to Sydney with her husband and 2 boys. Mandy is an anchor with the leading global business television network, CNBC. She also co-anchored CNBC's The Call with former director of the US National Economic Council, Larry Kudlow, in New York. She has worked extensively with other networks such as Bloomberg TV, NBC, MSNBC, and Australia's Channel 7. Mandy is exceptionally well credentialed, having interviewed political and business heavyweights such as Speaker Nancy Pelosi, former President Donald Trump, former US Commerce Secretary Wilbur Ross, Jamie Dimon, and Rupert Murdoch. Working extensively in the Asia-Pacific arena, she has also interviewed a who's who of prime ministers, CEOs, central bankers, and finance ministers in the region. In her spare time, Mandy enjoys spending time with the family, volunteering for charities, and emceeing various fundraising events. So again, welcome both Mandy and Innes, and I would like to hand over to you both now. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, Melissa. It's really my great pleasure to be here today and to be part of this business resilience webinar. It certainly is, I think, one of the very few silver linings to have come out of COVID-19, the fact that we're all doing so many more of these webinars together, being able to keep in contact across the oceans, and of course, doing these events together via technology is one of the benefits of our time. But I do say few silver linings because, let's face it, it's been an incredibly hard time for many people and for many businesses, the worst of times. So what lies ahead? What does the future hold? Well, that's why we have Innes in our midst today. It's a great pleasure to see you there, Innes. Thanks a lot for your time.
Thanks, Mandy. Hi, everyone. Hope you're all well too.
Indeed. So I would like to just quickly say to the audience, thank you so much for pre-submitting some great audience questions. But if you would like, while you're listening to Innes and I have a bit of a chat, if you'd like to still send in a question live, you can do that, because it's all about everybody feeling like they're part of this today and being part of the conversation. All you need to do is just use the chat function, and I'll get your questions over to Innes during the next hour. So Innes, let me jump straight in here, because I would first of all like to ask you whether or not you have been surprised by how Australian businesses have been coping, and whether or not the outcome of what we see today was what you would have expected when we first went into lockdown earlier last year.
Well, Mandy, that's a really good question. You know, we're probably still part way through, and we don't know how far down the tunnel we are at the moment, but we're only part way through what has been the greatest upheaval that we've seen globally since the Great Recession. And, you know, what we're seeing now is starting to see the fallout of what occurred last March. Business is resilient. It will hang on for as long as possible. It will adapt. It will change. It will find new markets, create new product. That's what business does. And in some ways, that explains why business in Australia has been able to be so resilient. And, you know, on the whole, though, you know, our economy has held up very well. What we don't know yet, Mandy, is whether that holding up of our economy is driven by business itself, or is that just largely off the back of government support? So is this period we're in now self-sustaining, or is it not? That's the great question we're asking. And we've got some data out today at the Australian Industry Group showing that right now, as of today, September the 1st, we're starting to see the real impacts of what I'd call this very clear second wave of COVID in Australia. You know, data out today showing that manufacturing, a big part of our economy that services the rest of the economy, all the food we eat is sort of manufactured, you know, work into the construction sector, all of that. That is showing today that we've sort of gone from quite rapid expansion over the past 4 or 5 months now. So we are now right on the cusp of getting into contraction. The construction sector is very much in contraction. So we're going to start to see the impacts of this coming through. And now with Victoria still in significant lockdown, the world's longest lockdown, I think you could now say it is at about 213 days now of lockdown. New South Wales in a different sort of lockdown, but now a prolonged lockdown. Those impacts will start to bite. And, you know, we also get data today to say, did we have a contraction in the June quarter? Maybe, maybe not. We'll find out later on this afternoon, but whichever, it'll be a tight run thing. But certainly as of today, it feels like our economy is contracting. So businesses are having to adapt again to this second wave. And this will be a real test. But up until now, am I surprised? No, because Australian business has always been incredibly resilient, resourceful. 1 in 5 jobs in Australia relies on trade. You know, almost 50% of our GDP is overseas reliant. So we've always been outward looking and adaptive, and that has shone through so far in COVID. But now we're about to really hit the next big test.
Since you mentioned the government support measures then, Innes, what do you think in those various business relief packages has worked and what hasn't worked?
Well, if anyone has the time or the interest, they'll see at the moment, Mandy, that I'm embroiled in a sort of a fairly massive rolling brawl with a bunch of commentators and others around the impact of JobKeeper. Yep. And there's an ongoing debate now about should businesses pay it back, and I'm happy to have a conversation around that. But underpinning that that discussion in the public square is the fact that JobKeeper was an enormous success at keeping businesses afloat. Now, we can have a conversation about whether it's kept zombie businesses afloat or not, but the fundamental of it was that without JobKeeper, we would have seen, no doubt, millions of jobs lost. Yep. It held up a lot of businesses that otherwise wouldn't have been able to sustain themselves through that period from about March last year through until September, that period when we were really on the ropes. That has been a huge success. It's come at an enormous cost. It's come at a debt cost, about $90 billion and rising spent on JobKeeper and JobKeeper-related measures. But it was fundamentally a success. But then it comes back to that point that I made earlier and you picked up on, Mandy, is this self-sustaining or are we still relying on the impact of that? Mm. And then, as we get into this second wave, we haven't seen a JobKeeper because the circumstances are different. It's not a uniform contraction we're in here. Our states are operating now at very different speeds. So our states are now starting to pick up the slack when it comes to government support measures, and they're all doing it in different ways. JobSaver is a New South Wales program. Victoria is much more grants focused and the like. They are successful, but not to the extent that business needs. They run late, they're rather piecemeal, and they don't cover the costs.
What more would business like? Yeah. At this juncture, what more would business like? What more does business need?
Well, Mandy, what business really needs, to put it bluntly, is for us to start to open up again. And that's the fundamental point we're at. We're now at nationally getting up well into the 40% of people who've been double dosed. That's where pressure will start to come to open up. I did a radio interview this morning and the radio host was very much, I've been double dosed, I want to get on with my life. There's sort of a bit of that sentiment going on out there. So what business really needs is to open up. People don't go into business, whether large or small, to rely on government handouts and supports. They like sort of some backing and some help, but they don't want to rely on that. And that's really fundamentally what business needs, is the pathway out. We have that through National Cabinet. 80% seems a long way away, but business needs to start to be able to get back to business again quickly. There's a lot of businesses working under huge constraints at the moment.
Indeed, we've got a number of pre-submitted audience questions on these very topics in it. So let me bring some of them in already. So, for example, and of course, the Attorney General, Michaela Cash, is warning the state governments already that their constitutional power could be diminished. Indeed, if their constitutional power to shut the borders could be diminished once we've reached that 80% vaccination rate nationally. So the question from John is, once that 70 to 80% double dose vax rate is reached nationally, how likely is it, Innes, that state and territory governments will work together to open borders, or will we see a continuation of COVID-free states keeping their borders shut? And what will be, of course, the future of business and travel in that situation?
Well, this is the $64 billion question, Mandy. Will they work together? Will they cooperate? And I mean, I don't like saying it, but what has been marked up until now has been the lack of cooperation between the states. I mean, we're all consumers of the media. You see the sniping on an almost daily basis, the different views and different perspectives. But the point is, now we do have a roadmap that they have agreed to start to really open up at 70 and then 80%. It's interesting, Europe, as a whole has just reached 70%. And to me, sitting here and talking to my European counterparts, it looks pretty open and has been for some time. The question will be, do we wait for 70% or Do we wait nationally for 70%, or do we wait for one state to get to 70%? Probably New South Wales, as the way things stand. And then what do they do? Do they say, we're at 70%, we're opening, we're going ahead, and then how do the other states react? You've already heard from Mark McGowan in Western Australia saying he would want to keep Western Australia closed off, even if we do reach 80%. Queensland has indicated, oh, well, we made that agreement before these cases got to the point they are now, so they're already starting to back out the door. I think there's a big role here for all of us in business to hold their feet to the fire. You've seen my counterparts at the Business Council today put out a very welcome letter, demanding the states stick to their agreement. If they don't, Mandy, then that's a recipe for chaos, quite frankly. We'll have different states go in different ways, and we'll lose our fabric as a federation. And the biggest issue, Mandy, that business have spoken about from virtually day one of this pandemic has been border closures, both the international border closure and the state internal border closures. It's stopping them getting goods across borders, people across borders. It's stopping staff wanting to travel around. It's just been a disaster, quite frankly. And just a quick example, yesterday I was told about the story of over 100 trucks trying to cross the border from Victoria into South Australia, if you know that border, getting turned around at the South Australian border, having to go back to Horsham, hundreds of kilometres, to all get tested again and then wait before they can cross the border. So our borders have pretty much become dysfunctional, and getting them open and keeping them open is going to be a key to our economic well-being and recovery.
And we can certainly have a conversation later on this hour about some of the negative implications of keeping those international borders shut in areas such as labour and skills shortage. Not to mention just the human toll. Everyone's got a really terrible personal, or at least they know someone who's got a terrible personal story about the human toll of keeping borders shut. But I have a question here from the audience, Innes, with regards to vaccination. And this is, of course, in the context of recent surveys showing the majority of Aussies do support they want fully vaccinated people to be able to receive that preferential treatment. So Trevor is asking, do you support that only fully vaccinated individuals should have access to the work site, travel, entry to venues, etc.? And I'm going to sort of dovetail into that my own question about, if you're an employer, if you're a company, how do you manage employees if they don't want to get vaccinated? It's a very complicated issue.
Sure is, Mandy. So we've got until 10 o'clock, and I'll take until 10 to work through this one. It's a big issue out there. So what we are proposing after consultation with our business members is an Australian version of the European Health Pass, which gives you the ability to do things if you are either vaccinated, tested, or recovered. So vaccinated, tested, or recovered. And if so that means tested within 3 days of wanting to do whatever activity it is. And that could be travel, it could be, going to a cafe, and it could be working. Now, the issue here for employers is that employers ultimately are responsible for the health and safety in their workplace. And what we are seeing are more and more employers, and I'd suggest to you that within this month, September, you'll start to see many more employers come forward and demand that their workforces be vaccinated. There's a lot of employers now working through that process, and that process is a process of consultation with the workforce. But in the end, the employer, as I said, is ultimately responsible. And you've had Qantas, Virgin, SBC, Alliance Aviation, a whole lot of other companies very quietly go out to their workforce and tell them that they need now to be vaccinated, and that process is speeding up. So you're going to see more of that. We did a survey 2 weeks ago, Mandy, which said a quarter of employers, over 700 employers, we just did a quick survey, over a quarter want to mandate vaccinations now. Another quarter would like public health orders, basically laying it down, making it official that you have to be mandated. Another 40% said they were looking at it, still working it through. And only 10% of employers said it wasn't for them. And where it is increasingly important or looking important are sort of in three sort of key areas. One is very public-facing businesses, so those like Qantas and Virgin, for instance, where you're dealing with the public all the time, and you can see that happening in retail, will be happening in retail, for instance, a lot more. That's one area which is going to be at the forefront of this. The other is where the workforce is very close together, factory types arrangements and the like. We've heard about meat processing being a hotbed for COVID. Those sort of areas, they're going to demand it as being mandatory. And then also jobs where people going into homes. So think of the community services sector, our National Disability Insurance Scheme, people going into homes to provide care and treatment and the like. That's another area where the mandatory nature of this will come forward. So we're going to see much more of it. And this will be sort of the issue of the day through the back half of this year as more and more companies mandate it. And ultimately, almost certainly, it'll be tested. It'll be tested through our courts, through the Fair Work Commission, where they have to make a balance between health and safety and on one hand and privacy and discrimination law on the other. And I think pretty clear where the balance will fall in the end.
So let's throw this forward a little bit about the cost of everything. And this is always dinner party conversation. And obviously, if the house is on fire, you
we don't do dinner parties.
Virtual dinner parties. I think I'm a big fan of the Friday afternoon Zoom drink with the team. But how we pay for it down the track. If the house is on fire, you focus first on putting out the fire. You worry about the cleanup later. So a question that's just come in from the audience here, and that is, Innes, do you foresee the impact from post-JobKeeper cost recovery, cost of the vaccination rollout, and the influx of Afghan refugees on the government economy holding down businesses' ability to recover quickly?
It's a fantastic question. And I think we don't, as a result of the past 18 months, we now don't have the tools and the weaponry at our disposal that we would have normally had to deal with, the economic situation that we're in. If you were to sit back now and say, hang on, we're probably going into a recession now, today, what would you expect government to do? And that would be government to throw a lot of support out into the economy, a lot of stimulus to drive demand and to hold prop businesses up. Look, government will probably have the capacity to do that, but it will come at an enormous cost, both financially now and into the long term. And we're already talking about, at that dinner party conversation, are we leaving a world where our kids and our grandkids are going to be relatively worse off as a result of all this? And I find it hard to say that that's not correct for a whole range of reasons. But, we live in a low interest rate environment. The big test will come, whether it's in 23 or 24, when central banks, and they're probably going to start that process late this year in the US, with the movements that the Fed are sort of starting to lay out a situation where interest rates will start to rise. And that's where the pressure will continue to really hit home, and governments will be more constrained. In the Australian context, Mandy, we're almost, Melissa mentioned, I'm chair of Migration Council of Australia. We're almost 1 million people down on where we would normally be in terms of our population. So, you mentioned skill shortages before. That's a huge issue that's emerging for business now. These are from what you might call semi-skilled professions all the way up to the high-tech, digital type skills. We're having massive skill shortages emerge within our economy at the moment.
Does that quickly get rectified once we do open up those international borders, the skills and labour shortages, or is it something that is perhaps putting the onus on Australia to start as quickly as it possibly can, retraining and upskilling its own workforce?
Well, let me give you the doomsday prophecy here, and I don't really subscribe to it, but when our borders open, I think there is going to be two-way flow of people. We're going to have people come in, and we're going to have a big outflow of people as well. People who've been cooped up here for a couple of years, just can't wait to get out, go to the US, go to Europe, and get on with their lives in a different circumstance. We're going to have that two-way flow. And the flow out will be more immediate than the incoming flow. So we're going to have another bit of a gap there as well, I suspect. But immigration will cover some of the gaps, but not all. You know, the National Skills Commission at its last report estimated that we had about 250,000 unfilled jobs at the moment in Australia. That's a huge gap. And that's with unemployment at 4%. So it's going to take a lot of time for that to flow through and for that slack to be picked up. How quickly do things like do student visas return and universities sort of start to pick up that system? That's a big inflow as well. Will people want to come to Australia? How hard will we have to work to encourage people to come to Australia, given that we have essentially lived in a gilded cage now for about 18 months and probably longer? You know, business hasn't been able to get out to the world. You know, we have to go out and do a big reconnection exercise, basically. So this is going to take, I think this is going to be quite a tumultuous few years of recovery. It's not going to be seamless. And going back to the original question, there's going to be enormous pressure on government, federal in particular, to try to pick up the slack and to fill in the holes here. But the capacity to do it, because of the spending to keep us afloat so far, is going to be much more constrained.
Indeed. We have a question on this skills training question then, Innes, that's just come in from Helen at TAFE Queensland, so someone who obviously knows a lot about this particular sector. And the question is, what role can vocational education play in the Australian economic recovery?
Enormous. It's enormous. And that's where a lot of the skills gaps are emerging at the moment. So Helen from a TAFE knows the pressures they're under at the moment to keep their students both occupied, interested, and, you know, doing real fundamental training in a virtual world. It's very difficult. Where I'm hopeful, Mandy, is that we will recalibrate things as time goes on. There'll be a lot more focus, you know, going into the future into what is called work integrated learning. People, as part of their training or their schooling, spending time in workplaces. Do they get on the job training? I think that's going to become much more important. But where we have a fundamental shift to occur, Mandy, is that up until we had COVID, everything, you know, in a general sense, was focused on getting kids into uni, and that was still very much the afterthought. We need to not flip it, but we need to make it much more an equal proposition now, because that's where a lot of the migration, in a way, came to fill in some of those gaps in vocational areas and above. We haven't had that. That's where huge shortages are. So there's going to need to be both a directional push towards vocational education and training. There's going to need to be an upgrade in vocational education and training to take into account the digital world that we're now in and how that all operates. And we're going to need to get workplaces and our educators working more closely together, collaborating, that old word, on how best to sort of fill these gaps. You know, areas which, yeah, we haven't done horribly on in the past, but areas where we could have done much better, and we now need to do much better.
Springboarding from our earlier conversation about essentially there being no free lunch, Innes, do you think companies should, particularly those who are perhaps trading back at pre-COVID levels and making pre-COVID profits, should they pay back JobKeeper?
Well, this is a great question. This is the discussion that's out there in the public square at the moment. You know, are they morally obliged? So let me go back a little bit, and I got, you know, the Sydney Morning Herald decided to have a crack at me this morning. That's okay, about this, and what the argument is this. Is this. JobKeeper, when it was put in place, was essentially a payment to a workplace, to an employer, to pay their employee. And that money, the employer essentially became a funnel to put the money out to get to their employee, $1,500 or $750, depending on what their work status was at the time. Some people earned a lot more under JobKeeper than they would have otherwise normally earned. So the money didn't necessarily go to the employer. It actually ended up with the employee. And a lot of businesses were under enormous stress at the time and wouldn't have survived. We've now moved on, you know, 12 to 18 months. Our economy has recovered up until now somewhat. So we are in different circumstances, but not all businesses are doing brilliantly out there. but some are doing better, and some have made the decision, well, that got us through. We can pay it back. Others are making the decision, well, yes, it got us through because that's what the government wanted to do. Now we're in a different circumstance. We'll just get on with it again. So different businesses will take different approaches to this. There is some public pressure for businesses to pay back, but different businesses have different capacities to pay it back. I don't think there's a one size fits all here. And I don't think we should sort of throw a blanket over the business community and say, well, everyone needs to pay back. A lot of the recipients were very small businesses, who just don't quite simply have the capacity to pay it back. So you have to be realistic about it here. And some businesses will want to, they'll feel it's the right thing to do. Others just won't be able to do it.
Certainly not a one size fits all, as you say, Innes. Before we move on to some other issues such as climate change policy and Australia's foreign policy, because I do have a number of great questions on those fronts, there's a couple of questions that have come in from the audience with regards to the building industry, because you mentioned how hard hit the construction industry has been. And it also speaks to the supply chain disruptions and the fact that, from everything from, building materials to, foodstuff costs, everything has gone up during this period. So here's a question from Debbie. Supply issues, significant price increases for building materials and much longer wait times. For those thinking of undertaking home renos or building a new home, how long before you think we'll see a return to normality in supply? And maybe that's a hard question to answer because it also depends on when we open up again.
Absolutely. So there's a lot of variables in this. So what our construction members are telling us was that with the federal government's home builder grant, let's focus on residential construction, where I think Debbie's question's aimed at the moment, that led to a huge spurt of growth and demand for home renovations over the past year or so, and it's kept tradies more than afloat. It's very hard to get a tradie at the moment because there's so much work going on. So there was a huge demand, but what they're now telling us, the constructors, is that when they look through down their pipeline to 6 to 12 months ahead, there's nothing there. It's very, very quiet looking ahead. So they've had a huge demand shock to meet, and now that seems to have been met, and now it's sort of tapering off and there's not much going ahead. So that's a worry. The second point is that we've got enormous problems in terms of supply chains, as they're called, of all sorts of things at the moment. Trying to get a car is quite difficult at the moment in a car yard, for instance, and in all sorts of ways, because our freight is very clogged, delayed. It takes 70 days to get a container now from Sydney to Auckland because of constraints on shipping and on containers. You've got a lot of our traditional suppliers are also under constraints. So China, for instance, very COVID hit at the moment. Their port cities are operating at well below capacity at the moment because of COVID. So all of this is playing into big shortages in supply and reduced demand. So construction is an area that I'm really worried about over the year ahead because of lack of supply, lack of forward orders. That's going to be an area that we're really going to need to look at, and we'll probably need. And plus, there's also a lack of migration, which was also a big driver of construction out in the burbs, basically. All of that is coming together to make the next period ahead for construction pretty tough. We released the data later this week on construction, but I'll just tell you that it is showing a very, very big contraction in terms of activity over the past month, which is a worry.
So contraction in activity means less supply of buildings, homes, apartments, you name it. So I think one of the biggest surprises has been just how much, well, I guess not surprising when you consider an extended period of record low interest rates to light a fire under the real estate industry in terms of prices. But perhaps that was one of the surprises. A lot of people thought that home prices would collapse, and they've gone the other way. So here's a question from Susie, and that is, where do you see the real estate industry heading on the up or on the decline? And I'm guessing this means, like, you know, will prices keep on rising in all of these cities, you know, Melbourne, Sydney, Brisbane, everything's going up, regional areas going up.
That's true. And everyone is, you know, not everyone, but a lot of people are sort of now in this sort of, as we get through this bit, are sort of reassessing their lives. You know, where do I work? How do I work? Do I need to be in town? You know, can I work from home or mostly from home in a regional centre? So regional property is really taking off. It's booming because of the way we are now working. You know, you're in Melbourne at the moment. There is no real estate. Real estate is closed, has been now for weeks. So, you know, you can't let anyone, if you're in Melbourne, you can't have your house open for inspection. You're not allowed to let people in. Real estate is closed off. It's a different scenario in Sydney, which has kept Sydney real estate going. So in Melbourne, you've got to think when eventually the shackles come off, there will be another deluge of property coming onto the market, and demand as well, which will probably have a bit of a price spike. But again, we get to how people are living, how they're moving, and how they get around. The other point on construction I was going to mention was when Sydney went into lockdown, I'll use the word advisedly, there was hysteria among constructors because unbeknownst to government, a huge proportion of their workforce lived in the lockdown areas. And that basically has ground construction to a halt in Sydney as well. So this lack of ability for people to move around is creating a false economy at the moment. There will undoubtedly be a huge, you know, demand spike, you know, when we come out of this period of lockdown, but then we're fundamentally changing the way we're living. And I think this sort of second wave of lockdown will just speed that process up. People in commercial real estate tell me they're still very optimistic about our cities as people returning to the office. I think from talking to businesses, I'm not so sure about that in some version or form of it, but it'll be a different sort of aspect as we come out of this. You know, the world, that sort of world, I think, has fundamentally changed.
Yes, and so we started this entire conversation off with a quick passing mention of the few silver linings that have come out, and for all the people out there who for decades might have been lobbying for greater workplace flexibility, to be able to, for example, you know, work a couple of days from home to look after children or elderly parents. You know, this new hybrid model, the acceptance of remote working has been actually a windfall. I've got a couple of questions on that point. One is, Innes, do you see the Fair Work Commission providing award reviews with a greater workplace flexibility?
I think it's a good question. I think absolutely that's the way it's going. It's the way businesses are going. I think for some reason, Mandy, the figure is, I don't know where I remember this from, but we did some work, and before all of this, about 3 years ago, about 12% of the workforce was spending some time working from home. Mm-hmm. You know, that was how the division was. And then in the Australian context, you might remember about 3 or 4 years ago, Telstra caused consternation, I'll say, by saying all jobs are flex, which meant that people could work anywhere at any time. They could work at home or in office. Banks were going down the path of hot desking. So there was already a movement underway of that had evolved from that only 12% to people that are being much more flexible. What, as in many things, as it happened with COVID, it has sped that up enormously. So now you now have a very clear white collar, blue collar delineation. It's the blue collar people, peeps who are turning up to work every day, making the stuff, delivering the stuff. They're getting on with it. White collars are very much at home and working from home. The office, as we know it, you know, everyone's office has probably just got a couple of people on it, and they're probably the IT team, you know, keeping everything going. There's going to be resistance from a lot of people to going back to the office, you know, doing the commute. There's no sign yet that has emerged, no data point to show that productivity has slipped from working from home. In fact, it might actually be the opposite in a lot of cases. So this is sort of with us in some fashion or another. And in Australia, we went through, or Melbourne at least, we went through a period between lockdowns where we tried to entice people to come back to the office, and it was hard. It was really hard. And you probably had about a third. A third never wanted to come to the office again. A third said they'd spend a bit of time in the office, a day or two or 3 days a week. And a third said, yeah, I'll come back, maybe 4 days a week. At the end of a second lockdown, we suspect from everything we hear, it's going to be even harder to get people to come back to an office or to work the way they did before. So the reality is that the world is moving in that direction. And coming back to the question, Fair Work will probably build those flexibilities in as part of award discussions. But there'll be a trade-off. There will be a trade-off somewhere that an employer will want in return for providing more workplace flexibility. There'll be a trade-off that an employer will seek. We don't know yet what they are around working conditions, wages and the like. There was almost, Mandy, a huge case to be launched last March just gone, around working from home, that the union movement was going to launch, which was basically trying to work out what employers were responsible for in the home workplace, electricity costs, all of those sort of things. In the end, they pulled that at the last minute and decided to work it through award by award. But I suspect, we were very heavily involved in that. I suspect at some point, all of the arguments underpinning that will come back and will be played out before the Commission.
Absolutely, yes, and all employers will have to rethink their compensation package structures, but that's definitely a massive conversation right now. I have two questions which are similar, so I'm going to give you a 2-for-1 deal here, Innes, because we've got more questions than time. It's a good problem to have. So one of the questions that came in from the audience is, how do we encourage manufacturing in Australia in a competitive and sustainable manner? And the other question is, could you speak about the expected impact of the shipping crisis that is now emerging? How does that impact Australian local manufacturing? So the question is, what's the future of manufacturing in these circumstances?
Well, it's a great question. And what happened after COVID hit was that we all may remember that we then got into these discussions around building resilience into our economy, reshoring, bringing back supply chains and the like. That was, it was actually, Mandy, one of the better conversations I've had with government. I speak to government every day, but I remember I did a lot of work for the National COVID Commission around the future of industry and supply chains last year. And that in part is what has driven some of the work that the federal government has since done around the Modern Manufacturing Initiative, to really focus on 6 key areas of the economy, food, medicines, oil and gas, et cetera, but space, defence. But we heard a lot around those terms. But in this conversation, I remember one of the very, very, very senior bureaucrats saying to me, well, the great takeout of all this was that government now realised that they knew nothing, literally nothing about manufacturing and how things got made in Australia. The whole concept of supply chains and their intricacies and the connectivity between business had sort of escaped their attention. Weren't completely dumb to it all, but they were naive to it all. How industry worked, the connectivity, the reliance on offshore for componentry and bits. We went through periods back then at the worst where companies were ringing us and saying, we literally can't get screws, nuts and bolts. Mm-hmm. That was laid bare. So what we are talking now with government around is around the concept of smart sovereignty. What do we want to be good at? What do we really need here? Now, manufacturing has changed. The biggest component of manufacturing now is food. Food manufacturing is well over a quarter of all manufacturing is food related now. So it's not sort of, metal bashing as it's called. It's sort of food. So the componentry of manufacturing has changed. Manufacturing now is also much more connected. It's much more digitalised. It's much smarter, as it were. to make something now, you have to be able to make it not just in one place, but you need to be able to make it in multiple places to make it and replicate it. So you've got, 3D printing and all those sort of things occurring. So manufacturing has fundamentally changed. My big problem is that I can already see the creep back to overseas reliance or over-reliance, on China and the like that has occurred. Nothing worse than Victoria, where I am, the state government. There was a big hoo-ha back in the day because all our PPE, protective equipment, masks, government realised they couldn't get any here because none of it was manufactured in Australia. Then they found one company in Shepparton, of all places, now unfortunately affected by COVID, which could do it. So it all got scaled up. The military got called in and off they went, produced millions of units. Now the Victorian government again buys all its equipment from China, all its PPE equipment, and 10 of the 12 machines in this factory are lying idle at the moment. So we've got to be smart in terms of government procurement around what we want to keep manufacturing going, but we have to realise too that manufacturing is both connected, increasingly digitalised, and we can't do everything here. That takes us to shipping, huge blockages at the moment. The price of containers has gone up from about $1,200 a 40-foot container to about $9,000 for a 40-foot container. So that is, and you're hearing it now from companies more and more, that shipping costs are becoming huge price constraints on them. It's getting very difficult to find containers. The big problem we keep being told is that when we bring goods into Australia, we don't make enough goods to fill the containers to take them away. Again, so it's not economic for the shippers, and that drives up the costs for us domestically. And that's something we need to look at. So that shipping is going to be a huge constraint.
Absolutely. And of course, companies can't always pass these costs on to the consumer either. So you mentioned China. So this is an excellent opportunity to pivot to Asia and to outside of our own borders here. I have a question coming in, and I'm also very interested on how corporate Australia sort of feels about our national China policies and how they've had to perhaps realign or pivot their Asia strategy as a result. The question from the audience here, Innes, is from Jane. Given the increasing tensions between the US and China, and I'm also going to throw in Australia and China for that matter, what is your advice on how Australian businesses can successfully navigate these escalating tensions?
Well, Mandy, the tensions aren't going away. In fact, they'll probably get worse before they get better. That's the view both from DFAT in Canberra, our intelligence agencies and business, quite frankly. You put all of them together and things are not going to get better. There's no mechanism to make them better at the moment. Everyone's distracted in China. They've decided that they don't really want to deal with us at the moment for a whole range of reasons related to COVID, apparent slights over this, that, or the other issue. This isn't new, though. It's been going on, quite frankly, since about 2015 or 16. There's been a deterioration in the relationship, and businesses has been carrying the relationship for a long time. The relationship has always been quite transactional. It's been goods-based, commodities-based, rather than people-based, if I can put it that way. We have a good interaction with Chinese students, but we don't have a depth of a relationship to on the whole nationally to carry it along. So it's been done on business-to-business relationships. All I can say is that we are never going to get to a point of being best friends with China. We're always going to have to navigate the tension between our security and cultural relationship with the United States and Europe, the United States in particular, and that economic relationship with China. It's always been a high wire act that we've had nationally. We've sort of been pushed off the high wire at the moment. We're sort of hanging on to it by one hand at the moment. Business has just got to keep doing business. There's no signs that China want to turn the tap off on Australia, but there are clear signs that they want to make it hard. And one of the stories that I have is that I had a member who imported glassware from China and had an order of 40,000 glasses, just drinking glasses to come in. And at the ports, they insisted that each glass have a label put on it, made in China, a label put on it. So it had to be unpacked, labelled, repacked, and then brought out here. Nobody knows why, but it took up a lot of time and a lot of effort, but it was a point being made to Australia. But that doesn't mean that that supplier is going to turn their back on China. They're going to keep going. They're going to try to continue to maintain the relationship, and there will be ups and downs. There will be difficulties in this, but we now are so integrated into China as a supply point for us. It's going to be very hard to completely walk away. But businesses are diversifying. They're reshoring a bit, bringing it back to Australia, and they're finding other sources. Bangladesh is a favourite, Vietnam, Malaysia, they're sort of the top three that I've mentioned. So there's diversification occurring. Business isn't going to be able to repair the relationship on its own. That's not the role for business. It's not the job for business. Just try to keep going and maintain ties. That's all business can do.
And one of the things that you do at AI Group is help Australian companies take advantage of various FTAs to expand globally. So this is right up your alley. And a sort of a related question coming in from the audience, Innes, is it's been 15 years since the FTA was established between the US and Australia. Has COVID pushed us to rethink that FTA terms of engagement? And are there areas that could be explored to further strengthen the FTA to better support Aussie businesses access the US?
Yeah, 15 years, it's gone by in a flash. I was there at sort of inception, and it was built off the back of the relationship, obviously, that has been forged historically, but came out of 9/11, and it was sort of the next step in the relationship. It's been slow to really gain traction, I think, I would say, because slower than everyone would have liked, because we already have strong relationships trading with the US. It's opened up or developed new markets, particularly in agriculture. Seafood, beef, for instance, been big beneficiaries of the FTA. The trick now is to get our relationships, and the US has always been a huge investor in Australia as well, and that hasn't fundamentally changed. The trick now, though, is to develop the business relationship so it does take into account more than just, agriculture and minerals, to take into what used to be called elaborately transformed goods, heavily manufactured goods, to build the relationships between businesses both here in the US. And when I was on the west coast of the US, what struck me was it was the second biggest market for Australian expats globally. It got to that point, but a lot of that was small business related, entrepreneurial, creative types, but taking advantage of one component of the FTA, which was the visa freedoms that were given. So we have to keep working at this and develop it. COVID has made Australian business, I'd put it more broadly than that, reassess a lot of their relationships and go back to markets they know and trust. And the US is at the top of the pile on that. It's a market with great regulatory systems, same language, all of that, big market. The US stands to benefit from Australia more and more, I suspect, as time goes on. Austrade has put a huge effort into developing economies. We just helped Austrade write their India strategy, for instance, and they're always exciting, but sometimes you just need to go to the one you trust, and that's the US, and that's always going to be a big market for us.
We have a cornucopia of questions still coming in, Innes, and unfortunately we've only got about 4 minutes left. So let me pluck one out from the climate change pile here. And this one is coming in from Mick from the UN. Governments of our large trading partners are getting more serious about climate change action. For example, the Biden administration rejoining the Paris Accord, the EC proposing, CBAM, the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. What can the Aussie government and Aussie businesses do to help ensure that they can also trade competitively in the future?
You left this to last 4 minutes.
I know, the meatiest one for last. One of many
I can do this for me. Look, the CBAM, interesting, Mandy, we did a big research project into the CBAM and found that it had minimal impact on Australia, but that's just because of the makeup of Australian exports to the EU. The fact, I think, that steel exports to the EU were accounted for about 0.4% of overall steel production. So it was minimal. The reality is, though, is that as we move towards 2050, business is leaping ahead here. You know, Melissa mentioned I'm the Deputy Chair of Australian Super. You know, we get a lot of, $240 billion fund now. We get a lot of pressure from other investors and from members to make sure that our investments are cleaner and greener than they have been in the past. You know, business themselves are looking at energy saving measures. They're looking at emissions output and the like, getting towards net zero. You're seeing pledges from businesses left, right and centre to be net zero, not by 2050, but, by 2025 in the case of some supermarkets, for instance. So businesses jumped ahead here. We have the COP in November, where there will be pressure on Australia to commit to net zero by 2050. I doubt that they will make a formal commitment, and the Minister, Angus Taylor, who I was speaking to last week, will stick to the position that, we will make our 2030 targets and we'll get to the target by 2050, but please don't pressure us. The pressure will come in trade. The pressure will come from the EU in particular, and then other trading partners who will put significant pressure on us around emissions and emissions level and abatement and all those sort of things. CBAM is just the start of it. Business is adjusting, and the US is going potentially down the same path under the Biden administration. Business is well aware of it and is adjusting. So I think the adjustment will be made at a business level. At a political level, it will be behind, and that's for a whole lot of domestic political reasons in Australia. The question then is, okay, commit to net zero by 2050. How do you get there? So What do you want first? You want the target or the plan? And that's sort of the conundrum in Australia. Do we commit to the target? And I think business has pretty much set itself the target and is now working through developing the plan on how they will get there. It is going to be, for the next decade or so, the big issue. As the world adapts, new vehicles. So you think of vehicles, transport more generally, buildings, agriculture, industry. They're the four areas where there'll be a lot of pressure globally and in Australia to play our part.
Most certainly, and adhering to the principles of the circular economy is now not a nice to have; it's a must have, right? I think I see a spin-off webinar on this very topic at another time. Unfortunately, we've only got about 30 seconds left, and I apologise to the people who sent in questions that we did not have time to get to. A number of personal questions as well, still very relevant. Things like weighing up the pros and cons of retiring in Switzerland versus back here in Australia, or individual opportunities for startups overseas. I do apologise if I didn't get to your questions, but to those who did send them in, thank you very much. And thank you, Innes, for your thought leadership. It's been a really fascinating conversation, and thank you very much for taking the time out for us today. Thank you also to AAA, a great organisation, beautiful, smooth running. Thank you to Debbie behind the scenes and the team. And thank you to you, Melissa, as well. You've popped up on the screen, so I will hand it over to you now to do the final close.
Oh, thanks so much, Amanda. For both of you, that was a really, really, really good session. I think we covered a lot of ground, but importantly, we didn't do it in a superficial way. So Innes, I really thank you so much for the way you responded to Amanda's and also the audience's questions. I think a lot of us would have gained a lot of insight into certainly the problems created by COVID and geopolitics at the moment, but also I think really importantly, actually the silver linings. And I'm so glad that we were able to identify the silver linings as well around the business resilience, workplace flexibility, opportunities in smart sovereignty, as you call it. And just noting, of course, that at the end of the day, the relationship is so important. And sometimes, going back to what which may maybe those relationships between Australia and America is a really important and valuable tool for a business. So thank you both. Thank you to everyone that has participated as well today. As I mentioned earlier, the AAA, this is about the 5th episode that we've done in this business resilience section. So look forward to future webinars as well around these and other topics. The webinar recording can be seen on our website, which is americanaustralian.org. And also, if you feel so moved to contribute to the philanthropic work that the AAA does as well, that opportunity is also available to you on our website. So again, thank you very much. And we'll bring today's session to a close. Thank you.